It's been more than 50 years since the release of Pong and more than 30 since Wolfenstein 3D came out. Realistically, if you're 30 years old today, you've probably already missed 20 years of games. The point is, there's not enough time in our life to play all the games, and this means that a game developer today is missing 20 years of innovations, features, and solutions that might work in modern games. But they're lost to time. I'm hella old, kids. I've worked on AAA and indie games, and I'd like to rectify that. This video series aims to educate gamers and game developers on what lessons we can learn from these older gems, but mostly to tell you what was awesome about them. Today's game, Duke Nukem 3D. It's January 1996. Quake isn't out yet. You've been playing Doom non-stop, and while everything about it is great, you wonder how awesome it would be to play a game like it, but set in a realistic city that you could explore. You've seen the Duke 3D ads in game magazines, and it looked amazing. Then you finally got your hands on a shareware, and in a turn of events that is more and more rare today, it didn't just meet your expectations, it blew them away. I dare say that the jump between Doom and Duke 3D was comparable to Mario 3 on the NES versus Super Mario World on the SNES. Duke was a big deal. Come at me. Let's address the elephant in the room. Duke has a bad reputation in some circles. He's seen as a misogynistic douchebag. I don't know about Nuke Nukem Forever, but in 3D, after playing the whole game, I can tell you that there's none of that. He's simply a 90s action hero. The game does have some juvenile humor, but Duke himself acts pretty much like a good dude and a fucking badass. So, what's so cool about Duke Nukem 3D? As I hinted, it was the level design. There had never been a game this immersive in environments that were this realistic. I dare say, old 3D Realms knocked it out of the park with the atmosphere. We got it all. Ambient sounds, sounds coming from objects in the world, dynamic objects, detailed lighting. It doesn't just feel like a map, it feels like a place. What helped this place feel even more real is the level design itself. Duke features the best example of level design that you can get in a first-person shooter, even today. This isn't a game where you unidirectionally go through a linear sequence of events and reach the end. These are open levels that you can actually explore. This is a place, a low poly place, yeah, but still, you get to explore it and this makes it feel so much more real. There's lots of backtracking, but there's always landmarks and shortcuts to make sure that you never get lost and that your path through the level is somewhat guided and planned. One of the coolest tools level designers use are destructible walls. There's nothing as cool as destroying parts of the level in order to access the secret or a way to go back more easily. The last big element that made these levels so immersive is the interactivity. There are sometimes ridiculous amounts of interactivity. Play a freaking pool game, use toilets, drink from a fountain, use security cameras, destroy absolutely everything that seems like it could be, find and interact with Easter eggs, and just more.
Much better.
These levels were polished, and then they polished them 5 times. This game was made with the build engine, and while this engine is much easier to use compared to older ones, it was still very limited, and doing intricate scripting was pretty difficult. Duke Nukem 3D does some crazy stuff. Open a door and fill a room with light. Activate the demolition panel and see a building collapse, revealing a way to progress. Shoot a bridge, floating in midair, and somehow have it fall? I'm gonna be honest, I'm pretty good at making build engine maps, but I have no idea how they did that one. In 1996, the build engine couldn't do rooms over rooms, but via mapping tricks, you definitely can tell. It's not a coincidence that Duke Nukem 3D was so loved. They put in serious work, and they did that on completely new technology with barely anything to use as a reference. The game initially came with 3 episodes, and once again, their composition wasn't left to chance, and everything is so well put together. Episode 1 is your introduction. It gives you exactly what you want, the realistic city levels, a power fantasy, and it keeps everything simple to ease you into this new technology. There aren't too many enemies, the difficulty is low, and while there are traps, they're kept to a minimum. Episode 2 ramps things up a little bit. It sends you to space, completely changing the feeling of the game, giving you something fresh. New weapons and enemies are introduced, and the challenge has a small bumpy bump. While space stations aren't as varied as different areas in the city, the level design is still top-notch. Episode 3 is where things get serious. We get back to the city, ready for these awesome realistic locations after all these space stations. But now we get our ass handed to us. You have to start being serious. Encounters are designed to be difficult and traps are absolutely all over the place. The game has gotten more serious, but also the essence of what's so good about Duke 3D is distilled and shot right up your veins. Compared to games of the time, Duke had a pretty varied arsenal. There definitely were classics like the pistol and the shotgun, but even then, they had a quirk to make them unique. The game also had one of, if not the first implementation of a dedicated melee button for times where you don't have or don't want to spend ammo. They managed to make the starting pistol relevant even late game. Compared to other weapons, it has very strong auto-aim and is very precise at long range because of that. The shotgun seems super simple at first glance, but it has a very short delay before it fires. At first, this feels off, but once you get used to it, there's something cool about charging a powerful gun before it fires. Dealing with this delay becomes kind of a mini game and makes the gun feel good. The gun also looks and sounds great. You can really feel the impacts. Making guns feel good is an art and a science. Obviously, giving it a nice punchy sound is critical, but you also need to have an animation that shows the weapon's power. It's also super important to make the effects of the weapon onto the world feel good. Everything can be destroyed in this game. Doing so will send shards and pieces flying. Enemies will yell in pain and will have several context-sensitive death animations that matches the weapon and how you're using it. It's not the best example of great shooting, but it's a fine one. Even the automatic weapon is somewhat different. A 3-barrel machine gun? It looks goofy, but it's good at stun locking certain enemies and doing quick attacks. It's always useful. The pipe bombs are surprisingly fun and useful, letting you detonate them at your leisure, and they're the weapon of choice to blow up cracks in walls. Then you have the more original weapons, like the Shrinker, which allows you to shrink enemies and literally step on them. Again, for the time the game came out, this was a technical achievement, and you don't see that often even today. The Freeze Thrower did what you'd expect, and then let you kick the frozen corpses, which was pretty fun. The Devastator did what you'd expect and caused massive destruction with quick-fire rockets. It's rather unusual for the most powerful weapon to use lots of small projectiles instead of a big bang, but it made it way more versatile. Enough about weapons. Let's talk about what you do most of the time. Duke it out with enemies. The game has a mix of slow projectile, hit scan, and fast projectile enemies. While slow projectiles are self-explanatory, fast projectiles are usually lasers that are fired by turrets or the common foot troopers. They're moving fast enough to feel like bullets, but you can still dodge them, unlike hit scanners. Doing hit scanners well is a tricky proposition. Many developers nowadays think that this is impossible and that you should never do hit scanning attacks. Duke 3D did a good job with them, although it's not perfect. Hit scanners usually have a small delay before they fire, which lets you pop back into cover or fire the first shot before getting damaged. Strafing or adding distance will dramatically reduce their chance of hitting you. Enemies also have very clear animations that allow you to predict how they'll behave, so you can counter their strategies. Enemies also almost always have extra behaviors. They don't just walk towards you and shoot. They can drop from ceilings, they can teleport, they can jump, they can use alternate attacks, and they can even feign death. The regular alien troopers will sometimes go into a death animation where they appear to be choking and you're allowed to finish them, which is super satisfying. The pig cops sometimes ride flying vehicles that you can shoot down before dispatching the alien itself. The enforcers will always surprise you with their jumping and super surprising snot launching attack. While many of the enemies are generic alien types, they still look great and have great animations that are easy to distinguish in a crowd. Bosses are usually circle strafe until it dies material and behave more or less like normal enemies, but this is a positive in my book. The game knows what it does well, and it doesn't need to turn itself into a frustrating puzzle game just for the sake of it. While the story is extremely bare bones, it does have a fair amount of gameplay-based storytelling.
Hail to the king, baby. The second time those alien bastards shot up my route. I'll rip your head off and shit down your neck.
The game never takes control away from Duke, and you always feel like you're driving the action. This type of storytelling is usually credited to the first Half-Life game, but could it have actually come from the Build Engine games? The game does have cutscenes after defeating bosses. While it would have been cool to have them in-game, they do feel like a reward for finishing an episode. It was pretty rare to see 3D sequence of this quality at the time, and they honestly gave me a chuckle. Since the story is so secondary, you don't learn much about Duke himself. Most of what you learn of his personality is from his one-liners. Duke isn't very chatty, but for the time, a protagonist that comments on what's happening and laughs with the player was unheard of. There's still chatty protagonists nowadays, but they almost talk too much. One-liners feel so much cooler when they're used sparingly. While the MIDI music in the game definitely works, I wouldn't call it super memorable. Some of the tunes are definitely catchy and a nice improvement to the mood of a level. There's an exception though. The Duke 3D theme is an absolute banger and one of the best video game themes ever. Boom! You know what's rare nowadays? Co-op. Developers make all kinds of excuses. It doesn't fit the narrative. People joining your game can't play main missions or save their progress. The game wasn't designed with co-op in mind. Well, you know what? The build engine supports co-op out of the box. You can play any level with friends. It doesn't make sense that 4 Duke Nukems exist in the same world, but who cares? It was a ton of fun and you get all this out of the box. And yes, there's also deathmatch. There's even deathmatch levels and multiplayer taunts in 1996. It wasn't the best balanced thing. The pistol had full auto aim and it often just devolved into shooting the pistol at random. But hey, it worked and it worked well. Now, that's all you can ever hope for today. A fully featured game with lots of polished content. But this is 1996. Games were amazing. Modding wasn't something that you thought might happen. It was a sure thing. This meant endless new maps and episodes, and even some total conversions. Don't you love the era of pricey DLC for any extra content? The editor was also really easy to use for the time, and there were really good tutorials out. Oh, I almost forgot. Yes, the multiplayer worked on user-made maps with absolutely nothing needing to be done by the mappers. It just works. End of quotation. That's it. The game is fun. I blasted through it on hard and it didn't feel like a chore at any time. Would I recommend Duke 3D to a youngster raised on AAA games? If they can enjoy 2.5D sprites, sure. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm ItBurn, the main developer of Nightmare Reaper, the crazy fun retro shooter / looter shooter with a dash of roguelite. I'm not biased. If you'd like more videos like this about your favorite games, or if you'd just like to support me, forget YouTube, buy my game! Links in the description.